you speak about the issue of evergreening and the access to drugs, especially in an international context, and what that means to American pharmaceutical companies? Especially, actually, the basis of my question is, I'm sure both of you know the Novartis case in India with the Indian Supreme Court. So if either of you could sort of touch on that, that would be great.
You want to just define for both of us what your definition of evergreening is?
I mean, at least in the Indian, oh, my voice sounds really loud. At least in the Indian Supreme Court context, Novartis tried to evergreen a cancer drug, and the Indian Supreme Court said that they couldn't, so they didn't give them another patent. That means that Indian companies can now generate that drug and sell it to countries that are not covered by the TRIPS agreement. So I'm sort of talking about that.
Let me start, and Ken, I'm sure wants to say. One of the projects that we have in public assistance is called Essential Medicines, and the purpose of the project is to particularly go to developing countries or countries that aren't as well-to-do as the United States or parts of Europe, and try and oppose efforts to keep patents going for much longer than they should be. In other words, to try and get the prices down when it's reasonable. I mean, Ken mentioned the patent issue. It's obviously a big issue, but one of the things, again, to the discredit of at least many pharmaceutical companies, is that there's something called pay for delay. They will pay a generic company a certain amount of money in a somewhat contrived contest over the the longevity of the patent, to keep their generic drug off the market for 6 months, a year. There is some action now to try and stop that, but for a drug that's selling $1 billion or $2 billion a year, this makes a huge difference. Now, you're describing something in India that is in this general sphere. I mean, should a company, for a reason that really isn't, you aren't creating a new molecule and creating something that is really different and legitimately patentable, but you're playing around. And this happens in this country too. They will take a drug that has a left-handed and right-handed isomer, which Ken knows about, and they'll patent the left-handed one. There's usually no evidence that the left-handed one is any better, more effective, safer, but they get a separate patent on it. I mean, dexfenfluramine is the left-handed version of fenfluramine, which had been on the market for a long time. They both caused heart valve damage, so one was more dangerous than the other. So I think the issue you're talking about is internationally, but to some extent in a different way in this country, how legitimate is the patent once it gets to the point where they've had their 17 years, whatever it is, extensions with some FDA laws like pediatric exclusivity. Is the subsequent extension something that should be granted? And as you point out, in India, the Supreme Court said no. My guess is it will be looked at probably properly on a case-by-case basis. Some drugs will have changed enough, developed something that is new and different and useful, both in safety and efficacy, that it merits some and others will not.
Yeah. The India case was an interesting case because it was really, it was similar to a case in Brazil where they said that they weren't going to cover a drug unless Abbott, who was maker of an AIDS drug, reduced the price of that drug. And it's within the purview of any country to rescind a patent. In the United States, they threatened to do that with ciprofloxacin, which was a drug during the anthrax scare back in the early 2000s after 9/11. There was a concern that the Bayer, which was making Cipro, was charging too much, and the government in the United States said, we're going to rescind your patent unless you make that drug more available. So that's a power that governments have. In the case of, this was Gleevec, the drug was approved, they had really gotten their use out of this drug. And it's very hard to sit here or anywhere really and say, no, they should continue charging a high price for that product, understanding that a vast majority of people are not going to be able to afford it. There's sort of a cruel irony at the notion of developing a life-saving drug that people can't afford. And yet that was the situation here. There needs to be some way to balance this. I know that this is something that happens not just in India, but in In Africa, it's happened a number of times. It's happened in Brazil. It's continuing to happen in Brazil. Lots of other areas of the world, this is going to continue to come up. There needs to be a way to resolve this. I really don't have an answer to how this can be resolved, but it's certainly an issue because the drug needs to be made available. There should be a way to make this, whether the rights are licensed to a local generic company in India so that they can manufacture the drug and they pay a royalty back to Novartis. That might resolve this issue. And I suspect that that's the way these issues are going to be resolved in the long run. It's just the industry doesn't like giving up any of its control, and that's what happened here.
Just a comment based on what Ken said at the end of his presentation, that the older business model was very high volume and low margin, and that increasingly the newer business model is lower volume and high margin. Now, you could say that in India, they wanted to have both the high volume and the high margin, and the Supreme Court said no, but there certainly is a concern. I mean, there are some drugs that have been recently approved or are going through the approval process now where it would cost $200,000-$300,000 per patient per year. Not too many people can afford that, and one has to think about focusing on drugs that really appear to be, as far as you know and as quickly as you know, to be a therapeutic advance. I mean, so many of the drugs for which a lot of this money is spent are drugs that aren't even arguably going to be any therapeutic advance at all, and yet the amount of money, whether one believes the 100 million or 1.3 billion, whatever, it's a large amount of money is spent to bring a 30th diabetes drug that has no evidence whatsoever it'll be any better than any of the other ones. And the same is true with obesity drugs and a number of antihypertensive drugs. So you're raising a good issue. I mean, this is exactly what our Essential Medicines program has been doing for about 20 years. It was separate from our organization, and the person who's now president of Public Citizen, Rob Weissman, brought this program into Public Citizen when he became the president a couple of years ago. It's an important issue, and the governments, as Ken said, beyond safety and efficacy issues, if the price is just off the charts and it is not affordable for the majority of people who need it, the government can say, okay, generic companies